So welcome back to TAR Institute. My name's Damien and I'm leading this month's Monday nights. And the essence of my topic this month is really it's trying to show the process of looking and analysing or examining my own life, my external, my internal. So really having some courage, and I think it does take some courage sometimes to really look inside, particularly inside yourself, but also to look at your relationships with others, and to use a variety of tools to examine and to look and see what's going on in your life and what's going on in your mind, and hopefully then to become a better person from that process. So last week we talked a little bit about, you know, what actually is a good person. You know, if we sort of say, you know, I aspire to be a good person. Well, what is a good person? So we talked a little bit last week about identifying that, particularly by looking at ourselves in relation to others. You know, if we imagined an idyllic society, how would we actually see others relating to us? How would we see others treating us, interacting with us, and you know, what sort of qualities would we expect from others if we imagine some sort of idyllic society? So I think it's pretty clear that what we would like from others is some sort of kindness, some respect, some assistance, some safety, you know, no harm, no sense of harm ever coming from others, no sense of you know, that we can't trust them. You know, we'd have a complete trust that we know that they're not going to steal, cheat, deceive, or mislead us. So these would be the sort of things that, you know, you would think could make my life a lot better if other people were like this. So we can use that analysis, because I think we find that pretty easy. To see what we expect others would be like in a perfect world, and then we can think then for myself to aspire to that collection of qualities. So so the particular idea of looking, what I've been referring to here is looking, is a little bit analysis. But sometimes the word analysis isn't quite, you know, puts us off, because it's sort of, you think it's implying a sort of a study or some sort of intellectual approach. So here I am more just in the initial, even before analysis, to look, to even ask yourself the question about my internal happiness. You know, what is it within myself that is a source of happiness? What is it outside that is a source of happiness? You know, what are the reasonable expectations in life? And, you know, I think particularly to try to put your finger on what it is that misleads us in life. So last week we talked about internal and external. So and I think it's always, whenever I do the Monday nights, I always come back to this idea of how we perceive things, and you know, to see there's an external reality, and then there is what what I perceive, and what I perceive is coloured by all sorts of internal things. So that's a point that I regularly, whenever I do the Monday nights, is something that is very important to me, and I think it's something that I try to share, is that to have some grasp of how each one of us colours our perception of the world and our interpretation as to what's going on in the world. And so what I am looking for is a way to show what the Buddha taught. So what the Buddha taught, I think he has given us a whole toolkit of methods that we can use for this investigation process. And so one that I will mention tonight is, the very first teaching that the Buddha gave. And so the Buddha, it's a little bit unclear exactly when the Buddha lived, but it's something like 2,600 years ago, somewhere around there, or maybe a little bit earlier, and in India. And so the Buddha became enlightened at a place called Bodh Gaya, which is in sort of central North India. And initially he couldn't think of anybody who would accept what he had experienced. And this is a very important point, that the Buddha became enlightened and then sat for 2 weeks or 6 weeks or something, just sitting thinking that his realization was such a marvelous thing, such a maybe miraculous thing, a completely different way of looking at the world, and that initially he thought that there would be nobody who would accept what he had experienced. And so then he realised that his 5 friends that he had spent several years in extreme ascetic practices would probably be the best candidates. So he went to find them, and he found them in Varanasi, and he then taught them. So the first teaching that the Buddha gave is called the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths start with the truth of suffering. So the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, the truth that there can be a cessation of all suffering, and the truth that there is a path that leads to that state of cessation. So the truth of suffering is the first of these, and it's to recognise that our existence is just plagued by suffering. All right, so the first suffering is the obvious one, sickness, aging, death, all sorts of problems, stomach aches, well, you name it. We have no shortage of the obvious sufferings, and if we start looking around, you look at the animals, the insects, and we see that they are plagued by suffering. And humans have it pretty good relatively, but still we are all plagued by suffering. So that's the first type, the very obvious suffering. So the second one is the one that I want to talk about tonight, and that's called the suffering of change. And for us, the suffering of change looks like pleasure. For us, the suffering of change looks like pleasure. And most of what we think in life is pleasurable is actually the suffering of change. And so this is something that we really have to look at if we want to understand it. And we have to really sort of dive in and think, like our initial reaction is, no way is that correct. That's our initial reaction. And then, so here is where I talk about there being some need for a courage to actually look and to investigate and to check these things out in a dispassionate way. So our problem is that we become passionately attached to our own view And because of that passionate attachment, it actually becomes a barrier for us to ever look into different ideas and to examine a different proposition about life. So that is something to look into yourself. That's another thing to look at, is this passionate attachment to my own view. And that passionate attachment to my certainty and my own view actually prevents me from ever learning or really developing and understanding something which is in contradiction to what I believe. So this is something I think is very important in studying Buddhism and maybe any religion or any philosophy, is that we will encounter things that are in contradiction to what I accept from my own passionate self-belief and self-understanding of life, my own modus operandi of life, which we sometimes clasp onto very rigidly and strongly, and we hold on to that with this sort of passionate, attachment to our own ideas. So here, talking about the suffering of change, it can be a challenge. And so the way to look at it is to go through some examples. So let's say a simple example of going down to the beach, in the summer. Not today. Today would be obviously the truth of suffering. But in the summer, you go down to the beach and you sort of lie down on the sand, and the warmth, and you think that warmth is fantastic, the sun coming on you, and then you're there for 5 or 10 minutes, 15, 20 minutes, and you start to really heat up, and you sort of then feel a little bit too hot, and so you go into the sea, and it's just wonderfully cool and refreshing. The water, just wonderful. That cool water just cooling you down, the cleanliness of it, the freshness of the sea. And then you're in the water for 15, 20 minutes, starting to get a bit cool, a little bit too salty and wet, And so you then go back on the beach and you lie in the sun again and you warm up. It's fantastic, So we would normally say that, I'm experiencing the pleasure of the sun, and I am experiencing the pleasure of the sea. That's how we work. I'm experiencing the pleasure of one Snickers bar, but there's no pleasure in having 10 Snickers bars in a row. But I'm having the pleasure of 1 cup of coffee, but 3 cups of coffee is too much. I'm experiencing the pleasure of listening to somebody talk, but it's gone on for too long and I'm over it, So if we go to that example and we look at the example of the sun and the water, our normal interpretation of that circumstance, our normal interpretation is that, the sun is really pleasant, but then I'm attracted to the water and I go into the water and the water is really pleasant. And so we have this sort of perception of pleasure on the two fronts. Okay, so the idea of the suffering of change is an observation that the sunlight on my body is actually a form of suffering. And as time goes on, that suffering nature of the sunlight becomes more and more apparent to me. And so I then start to feel really uncomfortable, and I go into the water. So it's not so much that the water is pleasurable, but that I have ceased the suffering of the sun. So what I'm experiencing is the cessation of the unpleasant experience of the sun. And so I'm then in the water, and as time goes on, I become more and more aware of the unpleasant experience of the water. And when I return to the beach, I'm experiencing the cessation of the suffering of the sea water. And so it's actually the cessation, it's the cessation of that suffering which gives me pleasure, not the sunlight that I am now experiencing. So this is a very important point to understand, to see that the experiences that I have that I interpret as pleasurable are not so much due to the new experience that I'm having, but they are more due to the cessation of the unpleasant previous experience. So the new girlfriend seems fantastic, okay? But that can be primarily due to the cessation of the previous relationship. And then as time goes on, the new relationship becomes grating and unpleasant. Okay? Not so, is it because the other person has changed? Or is it because that there's just always difficulties in relationship? And then when you end that relationship and you jump into a new relationship, everything is fantastic again. But the assertion here to examine, the point to examine, is that it's the cessation of the previous suffering. So going into the sea is the cessation of the suffering of the sunlight. Coming out of the sea and back onto the beach is the cessation of the suffering of the cold sea, not the pleasure of the sunlight. So this is something to really check and examine. The suffering of hunger is when it ceases by eating food, we experience pleasure. But if the food was the actual cause of happiness, was the actual cause of pleasure, then the more food that I ate, the more happier I would become. So this is something, again, to examine. So this is where I'm sort of talking about this quality of looking, is to actually look and think that, you open a bar of chocolate and you have a couple of, a row of chocolate. So there is pleasure. We experience pleasure. But exactly what the nature of that pleasure is something to examine. And so here, before the chocolate, I don't have any chocolate, I don't have anything or whatever. And so then the cessation of that state by eating the chocolate, gives me some sort of experience of pleasure. But if the chocolate was inherently pleasurable, then the more chocolate that I ate, the happier I would become. But we know that there's always a limit. There's a limit. We have a limit to everything. And so the more we indulge in anything, whether it's alcohol or sex or work or travel or whatever it is, building houses, buying fur coats or whatever it is, the more we engage in it, eventually we come to a limit of our own satisfaction where we suddenly see it as a burden, not as a pleasure. And when we do that, we blame the object. So what we do is we blame the object. But the thing we should be blaming is our misapprehension of this actual quality of life, this quality of existence, that the truth of suffering is that all contaminated things are suffering. And so my illusion of pleasure is due to the cessation of each one of those in turn. So my hunger, when it ceases by eating, I interpret that as pleasure, right? When I'm finished eating and I stop because I'm full, I interpret that as pleasure. But the Buddha's point here about the suffering of change is that both of these are evidence of the truth of the suffering of change. But my misinterpretation is that I don't see that. Instead, what I see is a whole sequence of pleasures, and in fact, I'm misleading myself, because then I end up pursuing a whole lot of things which are, in fact, suffering in nature, and I just go, effectively, I go from one suffering to another, chasing pleasure, but in fact, feeling dissatisfied. So what the Buddha says is that dissatisfaction in life, that unfulfilled experience in life, is due to misunderstanding the truth of the suffering of change. And so we mislead ourselves. So here, what I'm sort of getting at is okay, you've heard that. Nobody is expected to accept it straight off. I'm not expecting anybody to accept that straight off. But if you're interested, you can investigate this yourself in your own life and have a look and see if it's true. And then on that basis, you can actually have a lot more equanimity in your life experiences, because you won't build up the expectations of any experience. We can become so excited, such anticipation and excitement at something going to happen, and then so often it doesn't live up to that. We become disappointed, or somebody interferes and we get very angry, or we have all these complications go on in our lives. And I think a great deal of it is due to us not understanding this aspect of the suffering of change. So it's very beneficial for us to try to develop an understanding of that and observe it in our own experience. I can see it in my own experience. My anticipation, and excitement, some fulfillment, some reward, some great pleasure, and then so often the disappointed in life. But if we can look into this truth of suffering, this aspect of it, then we can be a lot more even-minded. You go to the beach, you lie in the sun, you go in the water, you lie in the sun, you go in the water. It's okay. Overall, that's life. But don't get annoyed, you don't get overexcited, you don't get sort of a disproportionate reaction. You meet up with somebody that you haven't seen for a while, maybe your partner or something, and you enter that meeting with such anticipation and loaded expectations. We come in with such expectation because we've signed up to this true pleasure. We think that's the reality. But if we really embrace this idea of the changing nature of experience and all that, we would not be so excited. We would not overload with expectations, and as a result, our interaction with others would be a lot more harmonious and even, because we haven't loaded it up with a whole lot of false expectation. And I think a lot of that can come from this misunderstanding of the changing nature. So there are some questions or some points to sort of like investigate. And the way I think you can do it is you actually just observe your day-to-day behaviour, your day-to-day interaction with others, and see these sort of things playing out. Your great excitement, great expectation, anticipation. The $100 million lottery this week. I'm certain to win it, because I've bought $10 million worth of tickets or whatever. but I'm going to win $100 million. So that's a good payoff. You know, this, you know, I think we can look at our own life and we can see this, you know, these sorts of things. So, and that's what I guess the one thing this month I'm trying to encourage is this idea of looking, you know, hearing these things like the truth of suffering, the nature of change, and that we misinterpret that in this way, then looking and seeing if that's true or not, you know, checking. And for a little while to put aside your own fixed or, you know, your passionate sort of grasping at your own particular set of beliefs that you have now, but to investigate maybe something different and sort of have that openness to investigate. So I think that's a really good skill to develop. So we'll do some meditation. So meditation, one thing that we need, you know, this idea of investigating, we need to have an awareness or a mindfulness so that we actually can have a little bit of our mind observing what we're actually doing. You know, so that if you're at the beach, you know, normally it's our normal behaviour in life is almost mindless. We just treat it as that the sun is hot. Oh, I got too hot. I go in the water's too cold. I come out, go in, come out. You know, so we're very external. We haven't seen my own role in that perception. You know, we haven't looked at my own perception of those two circumstances. So here, a very important part of this is to have the ability to experience that circumstance, but also see how you are interpreting it, how you are experiencing it. You know, have some sort of internal reflection that can identify how you are actually experiencing that thing at that time. So that quality of mindfulness, we develop that through meditation. So one of the real benefits of meditation is that we can generate a mindfulness or an awareness that will last beyond just the meditation session itself, and gives us the ability to have that self-awareness, that mindfulness and the introspection or the self-awareness of what's going on in my thoughts behind the actual experience. So that's a really good quality to develop. So adopt a fairly straightish back. It helps the meditation. And become aware of what your mind is doing. What are your thoughts? Where are your thoughts? What are your thoughts? And then bring that sort of like within yourself, you know, letting all of the external thoughts just fall away, and keep bringing your concentration or your focus like finer and finer. Keep letting go of the thoughts, distractions, memories, you know, until it's like as though you have no thought in your mind, and then turn your attention on the breath and keep your focus 100% just on that sensation of the breath coming and going. You know, your awareness of that. The breath just coming in, going out. And then focus 100% just on the breath. Don't let any distraction take place. We just do this for a couple of minutes. So just relax your mind a little bit and reflect on what happened in your meditation, so just observe or recollect what happened in your meditation, whether you were daydreaming or, how clear and stable was your focus, how intense was your focus, or were you just daydreaming or sleeping, fantasizing? So then, strengthen a resolve. We need a strong resolution to that it is very important that I have control over my mind, have the ability to observe my own mind. This is very important. And so with a strong resolve, like a really strong resolve, we'll just repeat the same meditation. So we, again, let all the thoughts drop away and bring your focus down just onto the breath and keep it on the breath absolutely 100%. So we'll just repeat this for the next 2 or 3 minutes, the same meditation, but with a really strong resolve to keep the focus on the breath. So once more, just relax your concentration a little bit and examine your meditation. So just examine what happened. And then again, strengthening that resolve, we'll just repeat the meditation again for just 1 or 2 minutes. So quite short, but go into the meditation with a strong determination to keep the focus just on the breath, just on a sensation of the breath coming in and going out. Just some sort of movement of the breath in and out. And keep your focus 100% on that. And then just relax your concentration. So we can actually learn a lot about our own mind in that meditation. Even if it seems like a failure, even if our meditation seems like a failure, we can actually learn a lot about the working of our mind, to see how readily the mind becomes distracted, and even into the most ridiculous sort of funny, daydreamy thing about the most meaningless things, our mind just is attracted to that and just slips into that and starts building a whole story. So we can learn from that about how, because that process is not limited to our meditation sessions. That process is actually happening in our lives all the time. Our mind is being diverted into distractions and daydreaming and fantasizing and different sounds or sights or whatever, just constantly split. So the argument goes that our energy, our mental energy, is so split and broken up that we really have not even got a glimpse of our actual potential in being able to do things and to focus and all that. And that meditation can help us sort of gather up all of that mental energy and just put it on one object and focus on that, and train our mind to be disciplined and focused, and that there's a huge benefit in doing that. So we've got some time now for some discussion or questions, so if anybody has anything they'd like to talk about? Yeah.
With the breathing meditation, I felt like I kind of saw a correlation between the entering of the water and really pushing back to the beach is the same as sort of breathing in and breathing out. Do you think there might be any...
So in your meditation, you were thinking about the beach and the water, were you?
Well, I was thinking about the breathing, and I thought, well, breathing in might be like...
A bit boring, yeah.
Yeah, going into one thing. Well, I just saw that similarity. And I thought,
Yeah.
would there be anything to know? I mean,
Well, look, even with the breathing in and out, you know, the reality is we can't breathe in forever.
yeah.
You know, we have to breathe out, you know, in, out. But look, whether I think to stretch it to be an analogy for the going in and out of the water, don't know if that's a valid connection. But the thing to learn is how even your distraction became quite sophisticated. You know, like it's interesting that, you know, and this is something we do all the time, you know, because the reality is that's a distraction in this meditation, but you've made it sort of, your mind is trying to connect it with the breathing to make it like a legitimate distraction. Do you see that process? You know, it's quite an interesting process that it's just a distraction, but the perversity of our mind is that it knows that it's sort of gone off, and then it creates this sort of funny, perverse justification for that distraction. You know, like these are the things to learn from you know, even from your distractions, you can learn what's going on in your mind.
It might be like a deeper thought, but it's definitely just an inappropriate time.
That's right.
Yeah.
And even if there's something very profound about that connection, at this moment, it's irrelevant, you know. But yeah, look, the mind plays incredible tricks because it's habituated to distraction. And so, yeah, but thanks for sharing that. Yeah.
I find that maybe if I'm really focusing really well, I can breathe for one breath without maintaining thought. But then my mind likes to contact my mind.
Yeah.
It's time to stop breathing and breathe out. And I'm just wondering what's some of your experience?
Yeah, so the question here, the observation is that for one breath it seems like it's going okay, but then a commentary starts. So, and I think I've shared this before, that when I started doing breathing meditation, I got really hung up on the, you know, let's say the breath going out, and then I'd start to discuss as to what triggers the breath to come in. You know, I just get caught up in a whole discussion, commentary on this sort of thing of the breath going out, you know, what is it that reverses it? And, you know, like, but just, it's just an indulgent sort of commentary, you know, like, it's just distraction. But I found it very, very hard to shake that commentary. You know, now I just restrain myself to daydreaming. So, but, you know, it's interesting, in the beginning, it's like, this young man's observation and that engagement in like a philosophical discussion about a connection to another experience. You know, it's in this context, it's just distraction. The same with that commentary. You have to, and I mean, there's a whole lot of reasons for this, but part of what goes on in our minds is that we are always looking for something more attractive than what is in this moment right now. We're constantly looking for something more attractive. And so even in the breathing meditation, we have to content ourselves with just the breath and fight the distraction, that distraction impulse. because we think anything else is more attractive. And we can, when we look back on the meditation, we can relate that experience to this suffering of change. I'm over trying to focus on the breath. I want something new, and so we become distracted. Yeah.
I've got a song stuck in my head.
Yeah. Don't tell us. Whatever you do, don't tell us what to say.
I couldn't stop it, so I just let it be stuck in my head while I still concentrate on the breathing. It's even stuck in my head now. I don't know.
Well, look, it's interesting, like the monks in the monasteries and all that, there's a sort of like a very strong prohibition about music. And music is a very interesting thing because it is so seductively entraps us. And so, the best thing is, if you want to develop concentration on that, you need to chop all the music out. Because there's something about music which is so seductive to us, and the way a song, here we might do prayers, or we might sort of talk philosophical things, and let's say even the Four Noble Truths. You try to learn the Four Noble. Oh, what was the first one? What was the second one? But you hear a song once and you know all the lyrics, and it's a very interesting thing. Why is that the case? And that, most of us, people my age, you start singing a Beatles song or something, you will know every word. And that, it's an extraordinary thing, and it indicates a sort of a seductiveness about music. But even for those of us involved in Buddhism for many, many years, naming the 10 non-virtues or the Four Noble Truths, or, remembering what FPMT stands for, or something like that, there's things that people struggle with, but they can remember 50 Beatles songs. And it's such an interesting situation as to why that is so. And it's to do with our grasping at the attractive. And that's why it interferes with your breathing meditation, and you can't shake it, because it's the attractiveness of it just overwhelms your desire to focus on the breath. And so that's why we have to really have a strong resolve to focus on the breath in the meditation, because otherwise we will never defeat that distraction. You have to have very strong resolution and have to see the importance of meditation so strongly that we can then fight the distraction of things like songs, or the colour of the carpet, or what's on television tonight, or whatever. Yeah.
Just wondering, are all concepts of pleasure viewed as the cessation of suffering, or are there some considerations of pleasure that's pleasurable just in and of itself, or is all pleasure considered?
Yeah, so the question is whether all pleasure is in this nature of this truth of suffering, or whether there is some pleasures that are pleasurable in and of themselves. What do you think?
Well, I was thinking of chocolate, if I'm not hungry and I'm not necessarily even craving something sweet, but I stumble across a piece of chocolate when I'm not hungry and I'm not craving something sweet, if I do eat it, I think it's yum. I go, that's pleasurable, that piece of chocolate is pleasurable, even though I wasn't, in a sense, suffering to be full or suffering to have something sweet, that kind of thing. Maybe I was suffering in some other random abstract way that I'm not aware of. That's quite possible. But
well, these are all questions that we can analyse and start to use different tools to investigate. So we could, if we grouped all of the sensory pleasures, right? So these are pleasures that are conditioned by or dependent on the sensory input. Okay, so we can examine those. And so the experience of sitting in the sun and the experience of going in the water are both sensory pleasures. You know, they're to do with the body, you know, the tactile. Let's say, you know, maybe the sunlight hitting our body, probably you could call that a tactile sensation. You know, going through taste, touch, smell, you know, hearing, sound, sight, of those, you'd have to say it's the sunlight is sort of a tactile thing. And the water also is a tactile thing. So both of those are pleasures that are dependent on the sensory input. Okay, so you can see they're all similar. Every sensory experience is going to be similar in that regard, that it's conditioned by the senses. So I would think there's a good chance they all suffer from the same issues. But there are pleasures that you could say are sort of separate to the sensory. You know, let's say the pleasure from generating warmth and kind-heartedness and love and compassion towards somebody. You know, that's a pleasurable experience. But it's not conditioned by some sort of physicality or transient thing. You know, it's a more of like a mental pleasure. So that's something to check, whether that might have a different, you know, fall into a different category. So this is a sort of thing that I'm really asking to look at. You know, you have this thought, so you use your own intelligence and your own tools to investigate that. You know, so, you know, that's why that question that comes up is such a valuable thought. You know, the mere fact that you questioned something about your experience, then you remember that question and you develop some sort of self-reflection or analysis on that question using whatever knowledge you've got. So it's more important for you to do that analysis than for anybody to give you the answer. You know, so that's why that question is a really valuable thing to have, is that to start that process of investigation. So. Yeah.
The question I think was kind of answered by the previous one, but it was around suffering and how Buddhism might suggest a healthy way to develop a healthy relationship with suffering, because it's fair to say that you never eliminate from your own life altogether. I imagine that to be the case. And if it's the sort of suffering that results in people benefiting and goodness, even if it's your own personal exercise, it's very physical, arduous, it's a form of suffering. It's not realistic to ever think that that suffering in that moment is ever going to feel any different. It's just an acceptance that I have to go through this difficulty and hardship. I feel the guilt and Buddhism say is a way to experience the suffering.
Yeah, so the question is about a mix of ideas there. But let's, just to sift out one of your ideas, is there a suffering where it's beneficial to engage in that suffering because the longer term achievement is worth having? And your examples like of going to the gym, becoming healthy and fit and all that is something which can benefit your whole lifespan. You put in 5 or 10 years of training and keep yourself fit, there's a benefit to your whole, every 24 hours of your life sort of thing. You know, there's a bigger benefit. You know, that's true. You know, you can, good health is happiness. So, just one example to assist with that analysis is the mind of patience. The mind of patience is, one aspect of patience is seeing some circumstance as unacceptable, or well, maybe not unacceptable, as unpleasant, or as as a disturbance, or as a difficulty, and then the mind of patience is a mind which willingly and unagitatedly accepts that. Okay, so it unagitatedly, without agitation, it tolerates or accepts that circumstance without becoming agitated. So you could say that that is a response to suffering. So the unpleasant circumstance, when your mind is patient, it takes that unpleasant circumstance and it deals with it in a completely unagitated manner. So even though the circumstance is a suffering circumstance, my experience of it, due to patience, is not suffering. Okay, so that could relate to some aspects of your question, right? And then furthermore, so again, in Buddhism, under this banner of patience, that, let's say like this question tonight, you know, this question about the truth of the suffering, and in particular the suffering of change, for any of us to actually investigate that and think about it is a challenge. There's a challenge. And you could say that for us to engage and think about that, it's like it's suffering. You know, it's a form of suffering for me to jump in and think about that and to reappraise my life in light of that analysis, you know, and it's a sort of like a bitter pill. It's a bitter pill to swallow. But in that same logic that you're talking about, there can be a huge long-term benefit for doing that. And so you could call that engaging in suffering or engaging in difficulty, but you willingly do it because the benefit from doing that is so great. And, you know, people that save others or, you know, do heroic things for the benefit of others, you know, can put up with a great deal of suffering and a great deal of difficulty, even to the point of losing their own life, but they maybe they willingly have engaged in that suffering to accomplish that goal. So yeah, and these are things we can investigate, you know, you know, the difficulty that so many people encounter in their daily lives, you know, trying to benefit others or trying to assist others, trying to look after their families or trying to look after the broader community or something. You know, they willingly put up with a lot of difficulty, and it's an admirable thing. So, but in answer to your other assertion, that the Four Noble Truths say that the Buddha taught the cessation of all suffering is possible, but it's a path. There's a path or a long process to get to that, and maybe not something that we can accomplish in this life, but maybe something that we can understand what might be involved. So, okay, so we can just finish up with a brief meditation. Really, you know, we have to recognise that it's all coming together, and thinking and meditating, discussing, you know, people offering their opinions and sharing their thoughts is really something very, very special, very precious. And so we can imagine that everybody's contribution to that takes the form of a ball of white light in the middle of the room, and then you bring that ball of light above your own head. So all of this virtue, this value, the value of all of us coming together is this ball of light. And imagine it pours down into you, enters through the crown of your head and fills your body with light, and completely fills your mind with clear, like a clear joy. And then all of that light gathers at your heart in the form of an egg, a big egg of white light. And then thinking about everybody else here in the room, everybody experiences difficulties, everybody experiences suffering. Everybody wants happiness, but they lack happiness. And so thinking from your heart, you send out rays of light that bring everybody else here in the room, bring them happiness and bring them freedom from suffering. And so you willingly send this light to others and see them finding happiness and being free of suffering. And then to your own family or those close to you, imagine them seated in front of you, and you send out the rays of light. Exactly the same. They want happiness and they want to be free of suffering, but unfortunately they experience suffering and they lack happiness. And you imagine the rays of light go out and enable them to have happiness and to be free of suffering. So like this, we can then start to visualize every living being. Every single living being we can imagine in front of us. We can visualize them in the form of humans, but every single living being, like seated in front of us in the form of a human, and the rays of light going out to every living being. And happily we send out that light. We send out the benefit of the class tonight. And generate a great sense of joy and delight at even being able to visualize this. And then let the light return and absorb back into yourself. So thank you very much for coming tonight, and thanks for the questions and sharing your observations. It was good. So I'll be back next week.